Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you for listening. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021.
2021. I remember, David, when the millennium came, and my mother and I spent it in Washington, D.C. I actually got to give a Jefferson performance before President Clinton, and we went to a big gala on the mall, and then it was so crowded that we had to walk across the Potomac bridges to get to our hotel in Arlington because there were no taxis to be had. And so this is a long time ago now. It's 21 years ago. And it seemed like when I had been a child, I had thought, I wonder what I'll be at the millennium. That's a generation ago now. And so now I'm thinking, I wonder if I'll live to 2050. But boy, does time pass, and boy, have things gotten different. So, we've moved from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan to George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bush to Clinton, and Clinton to Bush Jr., and Bush Jr. to Barack Obama, and Barack Obama to Donald Trump. And it's been on the whole peaceful. There's been some political rancor. It's risen over the past couple of decades. We're more partisan than we used to be. There's more mutual distrust. There's more distrust of our national institutions than there used to be, certainly than there was in the 1960s. But now we've reached this point where it all feels broken. It all feels, sort of in tatters, and like the wheels are coming off the vehicle.
Come on. Where's that Jeffersonian optimism?
No, I do.
I'll stand up for that.
I do believe that the guardrails are holding, but you have to admit there are some frayed edges to our democracy.
Well, the reason I'm optimistic is because of the subject matter of this week's show, which was Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address. And it's hard to read that document, or as in the case this week, to listen to Jefferson recite that first inaugural address. It's hard to do that and not be optimistic. His optimism in that speech is infectious. His humility, it's very admirable.
And I do believe that it was honest and sincere. I think 3 times in the course of the inaugural address, he talks about the possibility that the task is greater than his abilities and talents. I was pretty surprised that you got him to do it at all. And then you interrupted him because he was mumbling again. You had to ask him, you had to ask Jefferson to speak up.
Well, I kind of feel like after, 10 some years of having conversations with him, he cuts me a little slack, and I try to be as respectful as I can. I learned my lesson years ago by forcing the issue of Sally Hemings on him.
Yeah, that was the only
But we don't
walkout.
need to talk about that.
There was, he walked off the set.
Yep.
But in this case, I wanted to, admittedly it's a bit of a gag, David, but it's an important one because Jefferson really did mumble and nobody heard him. And so imagine this. I mean, when we hear like the State of the Union message, you can be sitting back in your chair and drinking a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, and you hear every word, and it just comes bombarding into your home.
Yeah, but I thought it was so interesting that, Jefferson in character was talking about, he had his speech, he gave it ahead of time to the National Intelligencer, which was a friendly newspaper, friendly to Jefferson. And he commented that it was sort of the technology of his time, and that he was able to give it to the newspaper so people could read it. And I thought, that's pretty, what would he do today? Twitter, social media. He took advantage of public media to get it out to people, as many as he could.
I just love it that he mumbled. This was one of the pivotal moments of his life. So if you think, well, there's July 1776, and there is the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, but if you really add up what were the pivotal moments in Jefferson's life, becoming the 3rd president of the United States is certainly right up there, and he has 1,000 people there, and he's the most gifted prose stylist of his era on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, and he writes a masterpiece. I mean, one of the 5 best inaugural addresses in American history, and then he muffs it He's just like
Well,
mumble, mumble,
we've
mumble,
we've
mumble, mumble, mumble,
we've
mumble.
talked about his voice before, and the small amount of writing describing his speech is a high, reedy voice,
And a
right?
stammer.
A high, reedy voice is kind of, and he's pronouncing their ings as een instead of ing. Kind of annoying. It's hard to think of Jefferson having an annoying
It is hard to
voice.
think of him. And so, there's something automatically wrong about the way I portray Jefferson because I portray him in my own natural voice. But if I portrayed him as he
Yeah,
really
please
sounded,
don't go to an irritating voice just to
and yeah, no one would,
be Jefferson.
no one would hang in there if it were his real voice. But you just think of what a strange phenomenon that must have been. Here's this is a key moment in American history. March 4th, 1801, not just for Jefferson, but for the very idea of our constitutional system. And so you would have thought that on that occasion he might ramp it up a little, but he couldn't or wouldn't.
But it was his writing that really made his mark. You think of the great speakers of the Revolutionary period, Adams and Patrick Henry and stuff, but they would speak to a crowd. But Jefferson's work was published and reached thousands. So, arguably he had more of an effect.
Possibly. I mean, but, someone like Patrick Henry could stir people into street actions. He could inflame a crowd. Jefferson saw that. And he actually says at one point, when he was young, he kind of looked around because he didn't have a father anymore. And he thought, what do I want to be? Do I want to be a gambler? Do I want to be a horse racer? Do I want to be an orator? And he puts it in this series like an orator is not that much better than being a gambler. So part of this is a form of elitism that Jefferson did have a lousy voice and he knew it. But on the other hand, he and Washington was the same way, by the way. They wouldn't speak up. They spoke in this very quiet little tone, and everyone had to lean forward. And they both regarded this as more gentlemanly than Matthew Lyon or Patrick Henry or even John Adams, these people that would belt it out. Matthew Lyon.
Yeah.
So part of this is, the question is, okay, maybe there's some pose in Jefferson's delivery, but I think not so much. But I don't think there's pose in his humility. I think he thought, all right, I've won the election. And in effect, I've saved the country because we've saved.
Yeah, when I say maybe, I mean in his presentation, not in what he said.
I think that he felt he saved the country. That's what the election meant. That we were not going to pursue the Hamiltonian, monarchical, high-tone central government path, but it's in a sense, now that he had done that, he'd already achieved most of what he wanted to achieve. And now being president, he looked upon with some anxiety because, first of all, it's consuming. It's all you get to do, even then. And he worked very hard at it. And secondly, you're not home at Monticello growing your petunias and your rutabagas. You're where you don't want to be. Your children are somewhere else. They can't come live with you. You're no longer married. You're a widower. You're living with Meriwether Lewis, of all people, in the White House. And Jefferson couldn't stand conflict. And he knew, I'm going to have a lot of enemies. I already have a lot of enemies. I'm going to have a lot more enemies now. No matter what I do, they're going to be people who just vilify me, who mischaracterize everything I do, who take everything I say out of context. They're going to go out of their way to make my life miserable. They're going to abuse me in the public press. There's going to be gossip about my private life. And part of him thought, that doesn't sound like fun. And so he has a sense of, he would later call the presidency splendid misery. And when he left, he said, never has a prisoner released from his shackles felt more relief than I do upon this occasion. What? I mean, really? Never has a prisoner released from maximum security felt better than I do on being allowed to leave the presidency of the United States? Amazing.
Well, with that, let's go to this week's show. First, inauguration. And it's so good to have President Jefferson back with us. And of course, we're doing this because we have an inauguration speech in the near future coming up. Before we go, anything you want to highlight? I know we talked a bit during the show about your Constitution course. I was surprised to hear that there were any openings left.
But we're going to open up, we might open up even a third section. So Constitution, go to jeffersonhour.com. This is so important. And a North Dakota course, by the way. We'll see if we can get 4 people for that one. And then there's going to be in the summer not only the annual Lewis and Clark trip, but also the River of No Return, the raft trip, the Class 4 raft trip on the Salmon River. So all of that, go to jeffersonhour.com. All the courses online and otherwise are there, and the winter retreats and the summer events, but also my website, clayjenkinson.com. So all of that is there. And I know you like to say at this point, and if you want to support the program.
Exactly. We certainly appreciate it. Go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. There's a number of ways to do it. And as always, very much appreciated. And with that, sir, shall we go to the show?
Thanks, everyone. Happy New Year.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I'm pleased to say good day to you, Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, it is a new year, and I wish you a happy new year, sir. And we have just come from a year of a presidential election. Our next president, by law, will be sworn in on January 20th. Recognizing that, I was hoping to speak with you this week about your inauguration on March 4th, 1801, a Wednesday, I believe, sir.
Yes, you've changed the Constitution since my time, and the original apparatus set up by the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia in 1787 called for the installation of the new president on the 4th of March. But subsequently, you have amended the Constitution to make that oath of office happen on the 20th day of January. So you brought it closer to the time of the election. We lived in a slower world in my era where travel was cumbersome and tedious, and not much was at stake. And so we could afford to wait a couple of months after the election before the installation of the next executive.
It's reported that your inauguration day was a mild one, I believe 55 degrees. It was the first held in the city of Washington. It's reported that there were morning artillery shots fired at daybreak, and that you provided the text of your speech to the National Intelligencer newspaper for immediate publication.
That's true. I felt that, I knew that I was not a great public speaker. I knew that only a fraction of the people who might be interested in my inaugural address would be able to be in the unfinished Senate chamber of the capital of the United States. And so I provided a copy of my address to Samuel Harrison Smith, who was the editor of the National Intelligencer, which was a newspaper in Washington, D.C. that was generally supportive of my politics and my administration.
Was this an accepted practice or something new, sir?
This was new. I was using an emerging technology, so it was possible to get the inaugural address out into the world almost instantly. So it was published in the National Intelligencer. I don't know how many copies they would have printed. It would have been in the hundreds. And then it was mailed to other cities like Philadelphia and Boston and New York and Charleston and so on. And then in those newspapers in those cities, it was reprinted. So, within 3 weeks, I would say, virtually every American who lived close to a printing press had access to my inaugural address to the extent that they wished to read it at all.
Mr. Jefferson, for some context, I'd like to reflect a bit on the city of Washington itself during your inauguration. I find some very interesting writing about this, written by Merrill D. Peterson. He wrote that, quote, Washington was a city of promises in the first year of the 19th century. Nowhere else on the American landscape was the contrast between resplendent ideals and insistent realities so poignantly stated. The village pretending to be a capital, a place with a few bad houses, extensive swamps, hanging on the skirts of a too thinly peopled, weak and barren country, was a grotesque symbol of the aspiring nation itself. Is that accurate, sir?
It's a bit harsh, I think. I wish that my biographer had understood the importance of the moment. And so we had grown up in colonial subservience. The government had temporarily been installed in New York and later in Philadelphia. But it seemed to me that a new nation, a nation dedicated to the rights of man as no previous nation had ever been, a product of the Enlightenment, that deserved a fresh start, and that if we had kept the capital in Philadelphia, of course the amenities would have been better hotels, better shops, better wine, better greengrocers, better tailors. But that wasn't the point. The point was that we wanted to create a symbol of a new nation conceived on new principles, starting over from a kind of tabula rasa, a blank slate. And so we decided to carve out our national capital in the wilderness, and by the way, at a place central to the original 13 states. And we knew that in the long run that Washington would grow to fill the district, but we had the advantage of being able to lay out the streets, to design new buildings based on classical or neoclassical models. I think it was a breathtaking and very appropriate idea. But, of course, you have to start somewhere. As you said, I was the first president to be inaugurated in the new federal capital. My predecessors had been inaugurated in New York or Philadelphia. And so the White House wasn't finished when I moved into it in the spring of 1801. The Capitol wasn't finished. Pennsylvania Avenue was mostly just a muddy trail with the stumps of trees still standing and pigs rooting in the streets. And whenever it rained, as it does quite frequently there, any carriages would get mired in the mud. And people complained almost. I think Albert Gallatin, my talented Secretary of the Treasury, said that the new city, the new capital, was despised by every member of Congress without a single exception. There was a lot of whining and groaning, and Gouverneur Morris, the high Federalist, said, "I find that it is a great city for future habitation. All we need are a few shops and amiable women and wine stores and hotels and other such necessities to make it a perfect metropolis." People complained, but I thought that this was an extraordinary moment and that it symbolized what was occurring. And not to be too personal about it or to show any pride, but I regarded my election in 1800 as the Second American Revolution, in effect the restoration of the principles of 1776 after a 12-year Federalist interregnum. And so the idea that we were starting fresh in a brand new capital, an unfinished capital full of promise, that struck me as beautiful. And by the way, the view shed from the White House looking down on the Potomac, it was very much a rural retreat. And as you know, I love rural life. Monticello is in such a place. And so I found it much more agreeable than others. But knowing how much people grumbled about this, I made sure that the meals at my White House were first rate and the wines were the best that could be had in the New World. And people sought invitations to my table. They sometimes begged because they knew that it was the best hospitality they could possibly get in the District of Columbia.
Sir, you lived in Washington for 8 years, and I'm certain you watched it grow with great pride.
I did. When I moved into the White House, there weren't even proper steps. The landscaping was deplorable. There were still leftover bricks and pieces of timber and mortar and other detritus on what would become the White House grounds. The wooden steps had to get me up into the building itself. Mrs. Adams, who was the first inhabitant, she and John Adams lived there briefly in 1800. She complained that the house was unheatable, that they had to keep, I think, 13 fireplaces roaring day and night to even dry the plaster in the unfinished rooms. There was almost no furniture. I mean, people love to complain because people like comfort and luxury, but I think if you can get beyond that and have a sense of futurity, look to the future, but also understand the important symbolism of a new capital for a new nation, I think that allowed me to overcome any sense of deprivation that I might have had. I mean, of course, in Philadelphia, my life would have been more comfortable, but it's not clear that it would have been more free.
Mr. Jefferson, you were 57 years old, I believe, when you took office as president, a demanding and a difficult job. Did you feel up to the task? Were you in good health?
I was in good enough health. I frankly felt maybe I was a little too old. I sensed that my energies were not what they once had been. I worried a little bit about this. I think perhaps worried too much about it. And I hate to discuss my health in this way, but I will say that stress has a debilitating effect on my health. It gave me migraine headaches, but it also affected my digestion. And I was, to be very honest, worried about whether I would live a full life because of my severe irritable digestive problems. And I consulted the best doctors in the country about this, including Dr. Benjamin Rush. And we tried a whole series of remedies, none of which worked. Finally, I found that riding horseback in the afternoon at a very high speed, galloping around the parklands and the meadows of the District of Columbia was the best measure that I could adopt to improve my health. But I would have rather be 47 than 57, frankly.
Sir, when you assumed the presidency, it was regarded as the first peaceful transfer of power. In other words, Mr. Adams' presidency was more of a succession. Would you agree?
Yes, he himself called himself the heir apparent. He had been the first vice president. He had dutifully and admirably served for 8 years as the vice president to George Washington. Washington had wanted to retire after a single term. He insisted upon it after 2, and John Adams simply regarded himself as the almost inevitable next president of the United States, and he was. He served a single term. I was his vice president, and so when I won the election of 1800, it was indeed the first transfer of power from one party of men to another, from one vision of the American governance to a quite different vision, and that gave us all a sense of concern and insecurity, because it's not clear historically that power can be transferred without mayhem. In fact, most nations have found it an almost impossible task. And that's why, frankly, hereditary monarchy exists, not because it's very virtuous, but because it works. The king passes on his crown to his eldest son, and his eldest son in turn passes on the crown to his eldest son. It doesn't make for great government, but it makes for a better transition.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break from this conversation. When we return, I'd like to talk to you more about your inauguration, perhaps get you to talk about your first inaugural address, sir. Would you agree to that?
Yes, of course. I regard the election of 1800 as one of the most important in our history, and I regard my first inaugural address as one of the best things that I ever wrote.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. We're speaking with Mr. Jefferson this week about his first inauguration as President of the United States. And welcome back to you, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
Sir, many who witnessed your inauguration that day in the Senate gallery and listened to your speech, they had a great deal of difficulty hearing you, what you said. Pardon me, but you are not really a noted orator. However, your inaugural speech is considered one of your best compositions. As you said, you took great pride in it. I understand you wrote at least 3 drafts of it, sir.
I worked very carefully. I wanted to do a number of things. Number one, I wanted to remind people of the blessing of being America, that we were the most extraordinary experiment in the pursuit of human happiness in the history of the planet. I wanted to sing the great song of America, our prairies and our mountains and our great rivers and the wide expanses moving towards the Mississippi River and beyond, room enough, as I said, for the 100th and the 1,000th generation. I wanted, too, to conciliate all of the people who voted for the other man, who voted for John Adams, because I was their president too, and I believe that we make more of difference than we should, that I believe we actually share more than what distinguishes us, and we need to remember that. And so I famously said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. And I also wanted to lay out in short order my own vision of a very limited national government that would be frugal and would avoid aggrandizing itself or meddling in areas that really belong under the 10th Amendment to the states and to the people. And so I had a number of tasks ahead of me, and so I worked very hard at this because I should say, first of all, that no matter what the politics of my time, I would have wanted to show that harmony is the essence of a happy nation. But because of how hot the contest had been, how vituperative, how disruptive this election had been, it's arguably one of the most consequential and disruptive elections in American history. I wanted to go to special lengths to try to restore harmony and to bring about unity and to make people more comfortable with me, especially those who, for whatever reasons, felt that I was a dangerous person to put into the presidential chair. And I know there were lots of such people that thought I was an atheist, people who thought that I'd spent too much time in France, people that thought I was too much of a Democrat, people who thought that I might bring about a collapse of the Hamiltonian fiscal system, or that I might sweep away all Federalist office holders and be ruthless in a kind of a revolutionary figure. I'm none of those things. And I wanted to really offer people the chance to get behind my administration and to put away their partisan filterings and just look upon me as someone who now happened to be the first magistrate of the American people for a short period of time, either 4 or at most 8 years.
Mr. Jefferson, I would be so grateful if you would consent, sir, to reading that speech again now, or parts of it as you choose, and feel free to break away and explain yourself further as you wish. Would you do that, sir?
Well, as you say, I am not an orator, and I never aspired to be one. And Patrick Henry was a great orator, and John Adams could be a great orator. There were a number of them, and it served them well, but it's not something that I aspired to. I had a kind of a concept of what a gentleman is, and I felt that a gentleman is not a stump speaker, is not somebody who thrusts his head back and speaks at enormous volume to a mass of people. So I should warn you in advance about that. But let me begin, and I hope that it will be in some way useful to your listeners.
Yes, take us to that gallery on that day, sir.
I'm clearing my throat, and I'm somewhat nervous, I must say. Called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country.
Mr. Jefferson?
Yes?
I apologize for interrupting you, sir, but could you give it to us in full voice so that we can understand the nuance of
But that
of the
was
language?
my voice, and as you perhaps know, almost nobody in the Senate chamber of the Capitol of the United States could hear what I had to say. They all leaned forward and cocked their ears to try to take in my speech, but I spoke it in such terms that they could not actually hear it, and that made it doubly important that it had been printed by Samuel Harrison Smith and the National Intelligencer, because most people withheld judgment about it until they found a copy on the street.
I apologize again for interrupting you. Do your best, sir, and we shall listen attentively.
Called upon to Is that enough?
Louder, if you could, sir.
This is going to be a strain. Called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country, I avail myself of the presence of that portion of my fellow citizens which is here assembled, to express my grateful thanks for the favor with which they have been pleased to look toward me, and to declare a sincere consciousness that the task is above my talents, and that I approach it with those anxious and awful presentiments which the greatness of the charge and the weakness of my powers so justly inspire. A rising nation, spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations who feel power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. When I contemplate these transcendent objects and see the honor, the happiness, and the hopes of this beloved country committed to the issue and the auspices of this day, I shrink from the contemplation and humble myself before the magnitude of the undertaking. Utterly indeed should I despair, did not the presence of many whom I here see remind me that in other high authorities provided by our Constitution I shall find resources of wisdom, of virtue, and of zeal on which to rely under all difficulties. To you, then, gentlemen, who are charged with the sovereign functions of legislation, and to those associated with you, I look with encouragement for that guidance and support which may enable us to steer with safety the vessel in which we are all embarked amidst the conflicting elements of a troubled world. So that, sir, was, in a sense, the preamble to my inaugural address. And now to more substance. During the contest of opinion through which we have passed, the animation of discussions and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers unused to think freely and to speak and to write what they think. But this being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law and unite in common efforts for the common good. All, too, will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate which would be oppression. And let me just stop there to emphasize how important this is. There was fear of the tyranny of the majority, that now that my party, the Republicans, were in power in both of the houses and in the presidency, that we would ride roughshod over the minority, the Federalists, or the merchant class. And my point is, no, that's not how it works in a republic. Yes, the majority must prevail, but the majority must be reasonable and must reach out to conciliate the minority. And without this, the republic would be bereft of some of its most important significance. And I go on. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that, having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of infuriated man, seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I know, indeed, that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot in the full tide of successful experiment abandon a government which has so far kept us free? Abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may by possibility want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it the only one where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the forms of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. Let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and republican principles our attachment to union and representative government. Kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of one quarter of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradations of others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the 1,000th and the 1,000th generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal right to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them, enlightened by a benign religion, professed in deed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter. With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens: a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, and shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. About to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you, it is proper you should understand what I deem the essential principles of our government, and consequently those which ought to shape its administration. I will compress them within the narrowest compass they will bear, stating the general principle but not all its limitations. Equal and exact justice to all men, of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The support of the state governments and all their rights, as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. The preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor as the sheet anchor of our peace at home and safety abroad. A jealous care of the right of election by the people, a mild and safe corrective of abuses which are lopped by the sword of revolution where peaceable remedies are unprovided. Absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority, the vital principle of republics from which no appeal but to force, the vital principle and immediate parent of despotism. A well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war, till regulars may relieve them. The supremacy of the civil over military authority. Economy in the public expense, that labor may be lightly burthened. The honest payment of our debts and sacred preservation of the public faith, encouragement of agriculture and of commerce as its handmaid, the diffusion of information and arraignment of all abuses at the bar of the public reason, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under the protection of the habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected. These principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. The wisdom of our sages and blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. They should be the creed of our political faith, the text of civic instruction, the touchstone by which to try the services of those we trust, and should we wander from them in moments of error or of alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps and to regain the road which alone leads to peace, liberty, and safety. Sir, if anyone ever asks what my vision of this country is, what I believe the proper scope and role of government is, especially the national government, you will find it in the paragraphs that I have just read. I repair then, fellow citizens, to the post you have assigned me. With experience enough in subordinate offices to have seen the difficulties of this the greatest of all, I have learnt to expect that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect man to retire from this station with the reputation and the favor which bring him to it. Without pretensions to that high confidence you reposed in our first and greatest revolutionary character, whose preeminent services had entitled him to the first place in his country's love and destined for him the fairest page in the volume of faithful history, I ask so much confidence only as may give firmness and effect to the legal administration of your affairs. I shall often go wrong through defective judgment. When right, I shall often be thought wrong by those whose positions will not command a view of the whole ground. I ask your indulgence for my own errors, which will never be intentional, and your support against the errors of others who may condemn what they would not if seen in all its parts. The approbation implied by your suffrage is a great consolation to me for the past, and my future solicitude will be to retain the good opinion of those who have bestowed it in advance, to conciliate that of others by doing them all the good in my power, and to be instrumental to the happiness and freedom of all. Relying then on the patronage of your good will, I advance with obedience to the work, ready to retire from it whenever you become sensible how much better a choice it is in your power to make. And may that infinite power which rules the destinies of the universe lead our counsels to what is best, and give them a favorable issue for your peace and prosperity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson, for helping us to recreate in our minds your first inauguration speech in that Senate gallery on March 4th, 1801. There are so many parts of that speech that I would comment on, but one thing I did notice, sir, is you gave a great deal of praise to George Washington, but you did not mention your friend, Mr. Adams.
Well, Adams was a one-term president. I don't think that he was a particularly good president, and I was annoyed because in the last days of his administration, knowing that he had been retired by the people, he packed the courts, sometimes with life-tenured people, including John Marshall. So I wasn't really in a mood that day to be as generous to John Adams as I would later become. And in retrospect, I believe I should have had at least a sentence acknowledging his work.
Very good, sir. However, you did an excellent job of leaving the door open for reconciliation with those who opposed you. All in all, sir, a very memorable speech and a great start to your administration. I thank you, sir, again for rereading it for us.
I trust you will allow me to retire. My throat is very sore now, and I'm feeling very embarrassed. I blushed through much of that, and I think it would be better, sir, if I retire to one of my chairs and do some quiet reading.
Granted, sir, and thank you so much again. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Across from me, at least virtually, is the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
So interesting. Jefferson's inaugural is famous. It's one of the handful, I'd say the top 5 or 6 inaugurals. Of course, it was the first transfer of power in American history, and it's gorgeous. It's a magnificent document. Jefferson touches all the right tones of reconciliation and freedom and limited government and his own humbleness in the face of the gravity and the importance of the presidency, and a generous tribute to his predecessor, George Washington, and a number of statements suggesting that America is going to be fine irrespective of its government, but getting its government within bounds and making it a limited national government, and restoring to a considerable degree the original vision of 1776. Jefferson really made this a masterpiece, and just reading it today, reading it through in this way, really struck me about what an extraordinary writer Jefferson is. I'm sure you felt the same way.
Yeah, it doesn't take much reading of Jefferson's works to understand just what a powerful tool the English language became in his hands. We've talked about doing this show featuring Jefferson's first inaugural address for several weeks, but we got an email this week from a gentleman, I believe from Colorado. He says he's seen you perform in Colorado a few times, Scott Major. And he asked if we would do this, if we would have Jefferson read the inaugural address. And in specific, he had a number of quotes that he was hoping he could get you to respond to, Clay. The first one was, "Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. We could certainly use a little of that sentiment in contemporary politics.
Yes, I'm struck by that too. So what is he saying here? That life is dreary. Life is not pleasant. Life is degraded by political rancor and partisanship. And so he realized that the election he had just been through was a very hotly contested, passionate, anarchic sort of thing, and that human passions had really been raised to a fever pitch. And given the tie in the Electoral College and the prolonged agony of the House of Representatives, there had even been talk from both sides of civil war, and serious talk of civil war. Jefferson himself said if the election was stolen from him, that the Republicans would call for a new constitutional convention, and that terrified the Federalists. And so it's hard for us to recreate the sense of impending potential disaster and the dissolution of the American experiment and the collapse, at least the potential collapse of the Republic. And so Jefferson was aware of this. This was not the election of John Kennedy over Richard Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower over Adlai Stevenson. This was one of the flashpoint ones, an inflection point, we like to say now. And so Jefferson wanted very much to say, we've got to bring the temperature down here. We have to restore to social intercourse. Of course, intercourse has a slightly different sense today. Social engagement, that harmony. And then he says, without which liberty, of course, but even life itself are but dreary things. This is that personal side of Jefferson. He did some of this also in the Declaration of Independence, but the Second Continental Congress cut out the more personal things that he said in the Declaration. That offended him, but they probably were making the right choice. Here he makes it very personal, that he's basically saying, I don't know if I want to live in a viciously partisan republic. That's not the purpose of my life. I shrink from that. And so this appeal, people are cynical in all eras, David. This appeal probably made a lot of Federalists roll their eyes, think that Jefferson was posing. They probably thought he was posturing also when he said he might not be quite up to the task and that he would want to depend upon their charity and so on. I'm sure there was a lot of snorting and eye rolling over all of these things, but to the extent that we can really understand Jefferson, he meant them. He really meant that and this is what Joe Ellis and I have been talking about for the last year, that a republic is in the end a spiritual enterprise. Now, Jefferson might not have liked the term spiritual, but you take my meaning. It's more than the mechanics of the Constitution. It's something about virtue in the Roman sense of the term, civic virtue and mutual tolerance and mutual respect and high-mindedness and trying to be our best selves and doing the right thing even when we don't feel like it. That this is what it takes to be a republic, and that if you descend into brickbats and talking points and ad hominem and innuendo and viciousness and mutual distrust, that's how humans usually behave in the history of the world. But we're America. We're going to be something better than that. But it takes a commitment. It's a spiritual choice. You don't have to be an extraordinary, decent, civic-minded human being, but it takes all the joy out of living in a free society if you don't. And as you say, man, could we use a little of that.
Going back to Scott Major's email, there was a couple of quotes that he referenced, and actually these came from another show, but he knew they were part of his inaugural address. And the other one was, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. And he writes that because of those quotes, he decided to read the entire text of Jefferson's speech, and says, I was amazed at how well his words could fit if given today, 210 years later, and that there are many parallels with this year's election.
Except that this one fundamental change or difference. At that time, we were a very fragile little republic clinging to the Atlantic shore in a vast continent, and it was a very, very dangerous world because the Napoleonic Wars were really sucking every neutral country into the maw of that conflict and really making it impossible for America to go about its business and to prosper. And so Jefferson had a sense of the vulnerability of America that we no longer feel. America is vulnerable in some limited respects to cyber meddling and terror and so on, but essentially that has changed dramatically, and America has a fundamental security in the international arena that it did not have in Jefferson's time. And so he's partly celebrating the fact that we have survived Europe, and that the distance between the United States and Europe gives us a chance to avoid the chaos of the rest of the world. So that sort of illuminates the beginning of his inauguration. But then he turns, as our listeners suggests, to the internal divisions in the country, and that's where he spends most of his time. But he also has an optimism that it seems like this has to be almost an inevitable optimism, David, that we have a population of about 5 million, 2/3 of which, maybe 4/5 of which, live within 20 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. And you have beyond the Appalachians essentially infinite space. Now, of course, we know there are native peoples living there, and that's going to become a very considerable problem. But to someone like Jefferson, he saw effectively an infinite amount of land over the Appalachians. And so his view is, how can you not be an optimist? Ask any other people who've ever lived on Earth what they would do with a continent if they didn't have to face France or face Denmark or face Norway or face Croatia. That we have an automatic advantage because we have endless space to grow into.
I'm going to go back to Scott Major's letter because he really touches on all of these things. He says, I appreciated Jefferson's humility in his speech, calling the presidency a task above my talents and humbling himself before the magnitude of the undertaking. And that stuck out to me as well.
Yeah, Jefferson says basically, well, he says explicitly, no one ever takes out of the presidency the reputation he brought into it. That the presidency is going to batter you, and it's going to compromise you, and it's going to awaken hostilities, because every presidential choice means there are winners and there are losers. Decisions don't rise to the level of the presidency unless they really matter. And so Jefferson understood that the presidency is automatically going to compromise your sense of yourself, and you're going to leave a little bit battered. And he did, by the way. He left on March 4th, 1809, having sort of survived the embargo crisis, and it had really cost him a lot of his popularity, and there had been widespread smuggling, and they had to create the Insurrection Act of 1807, which we're hearing about again in recent weeks, to try to keep order during this full embargo, nothing in, nothing out, to try to bring Europe to its senses about the way they were mistreating American shipping and American trade. And so Jefferson left office sort of with a cloud hanging over his head that an international crisis occurred. He'd done his best to address it, but it had pleased almost nobody. And a lot of people felt it's time for Jefferson to retire. And, when we look at this, David, you see the pictures, say, of Bill Clinton when he first becomes president and Bill Clinton when he leaves, or Barack Obama when he first becomes president and when he leaves, or Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush, and they all gray out. They all look a little haggard. I think it takes a lot out of somebody to be the president of the United States. And I think Jefferson was absolutely right about this. But he was the first to say it. He was the first to say, if in some sense this is a thankless task, and in some sense this is a nerve-wracking and even debilitating job. So, and he doesn't say it, but he sort of says, if you really wanted happiness, would you do this?
I'm going to refer to Scott Major's letter one last time. He talks about how Jefferson tried to, he was trying to reach out and make several pleas for the country to unite by writing, quote, "But this being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law and unite in common efforts for the common good."
We could use a fair amount of that right now. I've steadfastly in this Jefferson hour today avoided talking about the current situation. But this inaugural address, I wish could be read by every member of Congress, every governor, every state legislator, every member of the incoming cabinet, every member of the outgoing cabinet, because what Jefferson is basically saying is, look, folks, elections matter. That we have them, they're sometimes heated. A lot of stuff gets said that isn't strictly speaking fair, but eventually the votes are tallied. There is a winner, and not everyone likes that, but that's how the system works. We've pre-agreed upon this set of protocols. We've pre-agreed that we will accept the voice of the people as tallied by our state governments. And so his view is, get over it. Get over it. You can't delegitimize my administration just because you don't happen to want me to be your president. I won. It was fair. Elections matter. You've already agreed to abide by this system. You can't discredit a system that you've pre-agreed to abide by. And that, of course, is almost the most sacred of all American principles. And so it's really the first time in our history right now that we are seeing the system break down, and there is not a harmonious, I won't say peaceful, there is not a harmonious transfer of power because one group of people has decided that they are not going to abide by the pre-existing protocols without which there can be no democratic republic.
Yeah, well, it was pretty dicey during Jefferson's transfer of power, too. We've talked about that often. I must point out that I just can't imagine Mr. Jefferson looking at someone and saying, "Get over it."
No, I say that. He wouldn't say that. But don't you love this line? Sometimes it is said that men cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern them? There's no answer to that.
Well, thank you so much this week for taking time as Jefferson to read this inaugural address of his. It's an amazing. I would encourage everyone to take time to read it or at least listen through it again. Before we close this week, just a couple of things. I know you are in the midst of traveling to Montana for your retreats, and you're going to be on the road for a couple of weeks. I wish you safe traveling and a good time out there. And also, I wanted to bring up your Constitution course. This is like a smash hit. We're getting emails every day from folks who want to attend, and I congratulate you on that, sir.
Well, we start again at the end of January for 5 weeks. There's plenty of room. We're going to have a couple of sections. I hope people will do it. The Constitution really matters. We're going to be talking about pardons for the next year. We're going to talk about emoluments. We're going to be talking about the Electoral College and the popular vote. We're going to be talking about principles under which there can be an impeachment. We're going to talk about the equality in the Senate, that North Dakota gets 2 senators with 750,000 people, and so does California with 44 million people, and so on. So there's never been a time in my lifetime when talking about the Constitution, what problems they were attempting to solve, what they created, how it's held up in history, and where the wear and tear appears to be evident to us today. There's never been a time in my lifetime when this is a more important conversation. So I hope people will join us. Also, there are books. There are other courses coming. There's a course on Hamlet coming. I'm thinking of doing a book club, too, where we would do 6 or 8 books in a year, and people would sign up, and we would have sessions of the kind we had, David, with the town meeting right after the election, and more recently on the December 15th, the Jefferson Hour on Zoom. We'll be doing a fair amount of that in the new year. So all of that and more you can find either at the Jefferson Hour website or my own website, clayjenkinson.com. But I couldn't be more pleased with the coming Constitution, of course, and it couldn't be more important. And for all of that, it's great fun, too. So thanks for that. I just say this to all of you. Let us restore that social harmony without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things.
And again, if you want to find out more about all of this, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find the details, Clay's schedule, and you can also support the show there, and we really appreciate it. And with that, sir,
We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.